auspicious greetings and welcome to the Buddhism in the Sea of Islands webinar series. I am Jue Wei, Director of the Humanistic Buddhism Center in Nantian Institute, Australia. As is the beautiful custom of Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Dharawal people as traditional custodians of the land on which Nantian Institute resides. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all are, and pay my respects to their indigenous elders, past and present. Over the past year, the Humanistic Buddhism Center has worked closely with Deakin University and Western Sydney University to present this webinar series to you. We are also grateful to the Xingyun Education Foundation for its generous support. Together, we have formed a growing Buddhism in the Pacific worldwide network of scholars, some of whom are here today with us. Our research network aims to bring together scholars from different regions, disciplines, and institutions to initiate dialogues and collaborations around the study of Buddhism in the Pacific. We are also compiling articles from scholars in the network for a special issue in the Journal of Global Buddhism. All our papers trace a network of flows of Buddhism across Oceania and Hawaii. This webinar series allows us to share our research ideas with you. Each webinar since June runs every third Thursday of the month through to October 2021. Buddhism in the Sea of Islands kicked off with Anna Hallerforth and her team presenting us a glimpse into Buddhism in Northern Australia in the post-World War II years. And then in July, our team at NTI shared our research looking at the flow of innovations across the Fo Guangshan network of temples in Australia and New Zealand. Today, let's cross the Pacific Ocean together with Venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo and look at Buddhism in Hawaii. The speaker will give a presentation for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. A few words to introduce Venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo, who probably requires no introduction at all. Venerable integrates her scholarship and social activism. She co-founded Shakyatita International Association of Buddhist Women and Jamyang Foundation. For 30 years, she has provided empowering education to women through 15 schools in the Indian Himalayas, Bangladesh, and Laos. With research interests that include women in Buddhism, I look forward to Venerable's presentation of her latest discovery about the waves of change as seen in Japanese Buddhist women in Hawaii. Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo, the Zoom floor is yours.
Aloha, everyone. Bring you greetings from Hawaii. And I appreciate your acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples here in Hawaii. We're very much full of gratitude for our foremothers, forefathers who have come and blessed this land where I sit today. So I have, let's see, I want to share with you some ideas about Japanese Buddhist women in Hawaii. It has not been easy to do research these days because the library is closed and people are in quarantine. But I'd like to share what I've been able to glean with you tonight. I've been involved with the Japanese Buddhist temples here in Hawaii since 1972, maybe 71. And first in the environment of interreligious dialogue. Over the years continued to maintain those relationships. So what I would like to do is explore the patterns of adaptation of Japanese Buddhists here in Hawaii as they adapted to local circumstances, with special attention to the experiences of women over generations. I'd like to show how Japanese women who migrated to Hawaii helped shape a uniquely local flavor of Buddhism. So Hawaii is a unique geographical, social, and cultural environment. It's a crossroads of peoples from diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds. I was telling them here when we planted the Bodhi tree here on the Sakedita Hawaii land, we had prayers in 8 different languages. And that's typical. People, when they have a baby or they get a new apartment or they open a new office for their business, have a blessing, and they invite all of us. So we all pray together, and that's how we know each other. So it's very compatible. It's very collegial. At the time of Japanese migration, Hawaii was a colonized territory. As you may know, the Hawaiian Islands were illegally taken over by the United States in 1893. They finally got an apology, but way late and not enough. So because of that and the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II, awareness of social and political justice issues is relatively high here. It took the American government 100 years to formally apologize for its overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. Since then, successive waves of immigration, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Vietnamese, South Pacific Islanders, and many others have made Native Hawaiians a minority in their own land. In response, Native Hawaiian culture exerted a profound influence on immigrants in all spheres of society. And Native Hawaiian culture has made a huge comeback since the 1970s. Alive and well, I'm happy to report. Now, the Japanese immigrants who settled in Hawaii beginning in the latter half of the 19th century were largely contract laborers and most identified as Buddhists. At the time, Buddhism was a minority religion in Hawaii and poorly understood. Plantation workers hid their Buddhist home altars and images of the Buddha behind screens for fear of being castigated as idol worshippers. Christian officials initially refused to accept the validity of marriages performed in Japan and required couples to remarry in Christian weddings upon arrival at Honolulu Harbor. Only after protests by the Japanese community did the territorial authorities allow Buddhist priests to certify marriages. The first wave of Japanese immigrants to the Hawaiian Islands endured backbreaking working conditions, abuse by overseers, mostly Europeans, substandard housing, social disorientation, and racial discrimination. So here I quote, from the perspective of the white ruling class, the fear of the potential racial menace was rooted in the numerical dominance of Japanese in Hawaii, as well as their apparent foreignness. Not only on the sugar plantations, but also in the territory in general, people of Japanese ancestry were the largest ethnic group at the time, constituting 43% of the island's 255,000 residents in 1920. Most of the contract laborers spoke only Japanese, and they retained the values and customs of their homeland rather than adopting the culture of the host society. Now that was in the beginning years, but things have changed. Living conditions on the plantations were grueling and dehumanizing. Many records of these Japanese immigrants' lives, including entries written by women, mention the hardships that Japanese Buddhist immigrant women endured on the plantations. To cope with these hardships, workers and their families banded together to form small Buddhist communities that reinforced their cultural identity and bolstered their confidence. Among the diverse Buddhist communities that sprang up, Jodo Shinshu became the largest Buddhist denomination in Hawaii, as it was and still is in Japan, with both Hingashi and Nishi Honganji branches represented. Okay, so Japanese Buddhist women in Hawaii, waves of change. So I won't take time to introduce each slide, because if I get started, the time will quickly go by. Now, this is Eishimi, who was the wife of Shinran, the founder of the Jodo Shinshu denomination of Japanese Buddhism. Maybe if we look at the history, from 1868, the Meiji Restoration tried to break the power of the Buddhist monasteries in Japan, and one ploy they used was to require people to register with one denomination or another, either Shinto or Buddhist, right? Which, divide and rule, same story. So, but Jodo Shinshu was one of the largest. It is primarily a lay organization. And Shinran was the founder. He was originally a Tendai monk, but he renounced his vows and married Eishimi, who was a nun. So she's a very devout practitioner of the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, which is the major practice of Jodo Shinshu. Now the connections with Japan remain strong, and this is Lady Noriko. She was the wife of the abbot, of the bishop at that time. So in the early years, and even until today, connections with Japan were maintained. And this provided a strong link, but as we'll find, some of them didn't speak much English, and this continues to be an issue. In the early days, they were still wearing kimono for services and in daily life. So it was really a gradual transition. This is the earliest generation of Japanese Buddhist women in Hawaii. And the numbers grew over time, and they sacrificed a lot to build the temples. Money was always in short supply. And the women banded together to form Fujin Kai and did a lot of fundraising. They helped the temples a lot. And as you can see from these maps, they were spread out throughout the islands. In the north here, you see Kauai, and down below is Oahu, where I live. Oh, you can even see, I'm right. Can you see the arrow? I'm right here right now. Waialua. The temple in the sugar mill town here is closed right now, but I'm hoping to make good friends with them. Then you have Lanai, Maui, and the island of Hawaii. So you can see that there were Hopohonganji temples on all the major islands, quite a lot of them, a total of more than 80 temples. Now, Fujin Kai, these Buddhist women's associations, sprang up in all the temples at that time. This was the second abbot of Hopohonganji here in Honolulu, in Hawaii. And the typical pattern was that the wife would become the president of Fujin Kai. But this Bishop Imamura was very, very dedicated. He worked so hard to establish Buddhism here, and he especially supported the women, Fujin Kai. Here you can see them all gathered together for special events, and they functioned independently, though they would usually invite the men as a courtesy, and they ministered, as they started to call them ministers rather than priests. Just to give you an idea of the groups, that in all these different temples, there were Fujin Kai branches. There was even one branch, one Honganji, that was for Okinawans. And they came from all over Oahu, and they had their own temple. So up to the 70s, you can see the styles. The women started to have English names rather than Japanese names. And over the years, fewer and fewer could speak Japanese. So this created something of a language gap between the local Japanese here in Hawaii and the ministers who continue to be sent from Japan. So gradually things began to modernize, and the meetings began to be held and temple services began to be held in English rather than Japanese. And here they have their mumu-san, this Hawaiian saya. And they would receive the wife, the abbot from Japan, the bishop from Japan, and his wife. These were big occasions for them. Now, some of the activities that they engaged in, here they're shown collecting rice to donate to Japanese soldiers in Manchuria. So this is where things got a little bit sticky because in a sense, some Americans saw them as supporting the war effort from the Japanese side. They held sewing classes. They learned how to make Japanese dolls. They visited convalescent homes and did a lot of social work. Well, they put on plays and drama performances. This was the the Lantern Parade. Of course, Obon, but I couldn't find a good photo of Obon, but that's one of the biggest celebrations in all the Japanese temples here in Hawaii. And I'm focusing on Honganji because it's the largest and because I had the most materials on it. They also had a lot of fun. They would dress up as if they were back in the day or even in Japan, and pretend to be rice farmers. And they also had classes in Japanese dance, flower arrangement, tea ceremony, lots of different events. And they would occasionally fly to Japan to attend Fujinkai events in Japan. And they would invite the members of Fujinkai in Japan to visit Hawaii. So this was the Seventh World Convention held in 1989, which is when this commemorative volume was published. Now, I'm going to come back to the paper. Oh, I guess I could leave it, but well, anyway. Okay. So, where I left off was okay. So although the Japanese Buddhist schools and cultural traditions that were transported along with these immigrants and their religious leaders shared many characteristics in common, each maintained its own individual unique heritage and institutional identity as they slowly became rooted in Hawaiian soil. In the process of establishment and acculturation, Japanese Buddhist temples encountered numerous challenges, all the while serving important roles in the identity formation, social adaptation, and spiritual development of their members. The women always emphasized that they were not simply a social group. Their main concern was to support the women in their spiritual development. The women were called the glue binding the Buddhist community together. And these Buddhist women's organizations helped create and maintain Japanese culture to their youth groups, chanting groups, classes in tea ceremony and flower arrangement, and a multitude of other activities. They also had scholarship programs to send young people from Hawaii to Japan to study and so on. The ministers who were dispatched by Hompo Honganji headquarters in Japan were poorly paid, and their families were housed in miserable accommodations. One researcher notes that ministers from Japan were astonished with how low the pay was. So, because in Japan, they were treated very well and had, pretty, luxurious accommodations and so forth. So all the ministers from Japan were male. And, despite being shocked by the low salary and poor housing provided in Hawaii, they did their best. Rarely fluent in English, as I mentioned, and yet they were expected to manage births and marriages and conflicts and illnesses and deaths, as well as Buddhist education. Many of them also taught in Japanese language schools. They're trying to maintain language fluency among the younger generation. That didn't work out too well, but anyway, and the wives of these first missionaries also experienced great hardships. To gain acceptance for Buddhism in an overwhelmingly Christian environment, a sort of religious assimilation occurred. Pews replaced tatami, hymnals replaced the sutra scrolls, priests were called ministers, temples were called churches, Dharma schools for children and Sunday services resembling Christian services began. During the years that Reverend Imamura served as the chief incumbent of Honganji, he made a conscious effort to modernize Buddhism, using Christian churches as a model. He installed pews, composed Buddhist hymns, conducted services in English, and carefully curated ethnic Japanese elements in an effort to promote adaptation to the American context. Together with an Anglo-American, Ernest Shinkaku Hunt, who was a convert and who had ordained as a Honganji minister, Imamura developed Sunday schools and a young Buddhist association, consciously seeking to adapt Buddhism by adopting Christian standards for religious activities and ritual practices. Plantation workers and their families found solace and community at the local Buddhist temple. The early history of Fujinkai is documented in a number of sources. The most complete record is the one I just showed you lots of photos from. This beautiful book that documents the 100th anniversary of Fujinkai. It summarizes this establishment, development, activities, and the status of 36 branches that existed in 1989. So by 1989, some of the temples were no longer in operation. On the island of Hawaii, one Tibetan group actually got a temple from a plantation after the sugar mills shut down. So when the sugar mills shut down, a lot of the people moved away and there was no one left to run or attend the temple. So that's why you find a difference in number, down to 36 from over 80. Okay. A key reason for this publication of this book is that so that the youth will come to understand the unselfish devotion and wholehearted dedication, the humble services rendered by the pioneer Fujinkai women in their endeavor to uphold their temples as well as their organizations. She emphasized also that they wanted to counter the perception that this was simply a women's social club. She emphasized Fujinkai organizations are unique in that they are religiously oriented rather than primarily social organizations. She voiced the hope that members listen to the Jodo Shinshu teachings at every opportunity and become exemplary for the youth so that they will be able to understand that we are always surrounded by the wisdom and compassion of Amida Buddha. This sentiment is confirmed in a discussion of the practice of Mompo, listening to the teaching sincerely and gratefully. And this still occurs today in the Honganji temples around the United States. Sunday morning services, and now, of course, they're being recorded, and you can listen to them online. So by listening to the teachings, we come to realize that as human beings, we cannot escape our own earthly greed and passions. The knowledge of our powerlessness leads us to entrust ourselves to Amida Buddha and his primal vow. Our first and foremost responsibility as Fujinkai members is to make every effort to listen to the teachings. So Fujinkai was founded in 1889 by Reverend Satomi, who was the first bishop of the Honganji mission to Hawaii. It was formally established by Bishop Imamura in 1903, and his wife Kyoko was elected the first president that same year. Under Kyoko Imamura's leadership, the number of members of Fujinkai were active in social welfare projects, sports events, hospital visits, and other charitable activities. The active engagement of women from the earliest stages of Honganji mission is reflected in the photo taken in 1916, when the cornerstone was laid at Hompo Honganji Betsuin on Pali Highway in Honolulu. Now, this is really significant. As many of you are aware, recently there's been a huge outcry, especially in the United States, at the portrayal of Buddhism in the United States as a white people's achievement. And we find that, in fact, Japanese, Asian American Buddhists have been neglected in the telling of the story of Buddhism in America. Not only Asian Americans, but also Asian Buddhists. So I've always recognized three different groups here, not only in Hawaii, but throughout the country, of Asian Buddhists, Asian American Buddhists, and then Anglo, we don't have a good word, non-Asian Buddhists. And in fact, the Asian Americans came first, and their history has been neglected, and that's one reason I wanted to present this research. So the construction of Betsuin, that means headquarters, was completed 2 years later. This provided a venue for numerous Fujinkai activities, including memorial services, Sunday school classes, New Year's services, Buddhist talks, and social welfare work. Members came together for events such as commemorating the founding of Hawaii Honganji and the 700th memorial anniversary of Shinran Shonin, the founder, right, 700 years later. So over the years, Fujinkai members assisted substantially in fundraising for renovation projects at the temple, and a Fujinkai hall that was completed in 1964. It's still here. When Pearl City Honganji Temple and priest quarters burned to the ground in 1936, Fujinkai organized bazaars to raise funds for its reconstruction. In April 1954, the Hawaii Federation of Hompo Honganji Buddhist Women's Association formed to unite all the Fujinkai in Hawaii. So this book documents 5 conventions organized in Hawaii, held every 4 years from 1969 to 1985, focusing on themes such as gratitude, harmony, the sustaining power of the Nembutsu, and so on. Members also attended the World Federation of Jodo Shinju Honganji Buddhist Women's Association conventions held internationally from 1961 to 86 in Kyoto, New York City, Honolulu, San Francisco, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. So there's a research project for you too, is to research Buddhist women in Brazil, because in fact, I learned accidentally in a museum in Hiroshima, in Yokohama, when Anna and I went to a sociology conference, that in fact, there were more Japanese immigrants in Brazil than there are in the United States, including Hawaii, which was not part of the United States at that time. Since then, however, the number of branches has decreased. The Kahuku branch closed when the mission shut its doors in 2013 after serving the community for 111 years. The Waialua Buddhist Women's Association is no longer in existence, although the mission near the old Waialua sugar mill down the road here is still maintained and opens on special occasions. The Kailua branch has also withdrawn from BWA, Buddhist Women's Association, as it's been renamed. Although the temple, now renamed Windward Buddhist Temple, is thriving, primarily under the leadership of women. 3 temples on Kauai, in Hanapepe, Lua, and Waimea, have joined together under the name West Kauai Honganji. There are many smaller temples on the island of Hawaii, but the precise number of women involved in BWA today is uncertain. So we're still gathering information on this. At the Ministers' General Conference in 1916, the influential Bishop Imamura voiced his concerns over the future propagation of Buddhism in Hawaii. He described the qualifications of an ideal minister, including a re-examination of one's own faith, an understanding of the situations faced by immigrants, and the importance of Nisei education, Nisei meaning second generation, and the need to learn about the United States. He advised the ministers in attendance what to emphasize when instructing their congregation, and among them were the qualifications of a good wife, so including obedience. So this is obviously dated. So on one hand, he was a great defender, supporter of the women. On the other hand, he was also a product of this culture. And these 3 cardinal virtues that he put out. Obedience to her elders, single-minded devotion to her husband, and love and self-sacrifice for her children's sake. So he was advising the ministers that they should all emphasize these cardinal virtues of a wife, a good wife, in their sermons. But whether and to what extent the women of Fujin Kai took these 3 cardinal virtues of a good wife to heart is not known. He had specific ideas also about the qualifications of a minister's wife. And she was supposed to be well-versed in the Japanese arts and so forth, music, and be able to teach Buddhist hymns. So the principles reflected in the Fujin Kai women's own statements reflected somewhat different priorities than pious obedience to their elders and single-minded devotion to their husbands. When a woman became a member of Fujin Kai, she recited this Buddhist women's pledge. As a person of Buddhist faith, I will follow Shinran Shonin, who sought to live the life of truth, appreciate fully the blessing of human existence, thoroughly hear the primal vow of the Buddha, and diligently strive to live the Nembutsu as a Buddhist woman. So their motives, the women's motives, expressed in their own words, in their own pledge, was more spiritual in nature. So women's ways of resistance, you might say. I know there's some pushback on this idea, but I see it in many societies among Buddhist women. They have their ways of resistance. The Buddhist understanding and expansive aspirations of Fujin Kai members were also revealed in the objectives set forth by the Hawaii Federation of Hompo Honganji Buddhist Women's Association to unify, assist, and cooperate with all Buddhist women's associations in the state of Hawaii. to expand Jodo Shinshu in the state of Hawaii, to assist in the development of Buddhist women's organizations, to advance and promote Buddhism throughout the world, to cooperate with the Buddhist women's organizations of the world, and coordinate activities through active participation. Well, we have tried again and again to encourage the participation of Hompo Honganji in Sakadita, for example, but it hasn't gone as well as we hoped, but we're still trying. I lost my place. Okay, so in any case, now we come to the war years. So waves of change. The war years were a time of, again, great hardship for the Japanese community in Hawaii. Both immediately after Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, 1941, FDR ordered the forcible relocation and internment of roughly 120,000 Japanese, both permanent residents and US citizens. The extent, timing, and religious implications of this unconstitutional incarceration have not been widely acknowledged, even though the United States government formally apologized to those who were still alive in 1988. Turns out that even 5 years before that, President Roosevelt had endorsed a plan to investigate Japanese Buddhists in Hawaii and California and elsewhere to assess their loyalties and the extent of their assimilation relative to Japanese Christians, and to identify dangerous and potentially dangerous individuals. So if you've read Duncan Williams' book, American Sutra, you know that the Japanese Christians were not interned, very few of them, yeah? So there was discrimination, religious discrimination at play here in this episode, this horrifying episode in American history. So these investigations concluded that Buddhists were more likely than their Christian counterparts to identify with Japan and less able to properly Americanize. So I do want to leave time for questions, but just to say that Japanese and Japanese Americans had different experiences during the war years. Those who were born in Hawaii but had spent time in Japan and returned to Hawaii, we call it Kirei. And those who were born on the mainland, continental US, but migrated to Hawaii, we call them katong. Means that's the sound of getting hit on the head by a coconut. Like they're from the mainland, so they don't know how to get out of the way of the coconuts. They had very different experiences. Anyone who had studied in Japan or even visited Japan was suspect. So, so these experiences were also part of the Japanese Buddhist women's history. And many of them were very difficult experiences. There's more of that history here, but okay, so just as Japanese Buddhists suffered more than Japanese Christians, Japanese women suffered more than Japanese men. Although women of Japanese descent in Hawaii were in turn less frequently than men, because the arrests focused on priests. They couldn't incarcerate everyone here in Hawaii because it was half the population. So they concentrated on the priests, the Japanese language teachers, prominent business leaders who were typically male. So the internment of the Buddhist priests left their families in a precarious situation with no financial support or personal guidance. So there's some very heartbreaking stories. about how the families of these priests endured. Some even went to the camps voluntarily in order to be reunited with their father, their husband and father. So, but many of them talk about how traumatizing it was to have their father taken away in the night. What had he done wrong? He was the symbol of kindness and a leader in the community. And why were they taking him away and shipping him off to the mainland? So adapting to circumstances and helping others deal with the difficulties of life is a common theme in the history of Buddhist women in Hawaii. So another common theme in the adaptation of Japanese Buddhism in the Hawaiian landscape has been a shift in language from Japanese to English in homes and temples throughout Hawaii. The shift in language mirrors a shift in socialization process and the degree of adaptation to local culture across generations. It's significant that this volume actually is written in English, but it also includes a few pages in Japanese. Of course, most of the people are, by this time, by 1989, were English speaking. Sometimes didn't know Japanese at all. So cultural accommodation and eventual assimilation entailed a gradual shift from Japanese to English among the Japanese American population in Hawaii. First generation Issei parents generally spoke Japanese at home and often spoke limited English. Their second generation children who were born in Hawaii and attended compulsory English medium schools were fluent in English. And while most were able to understand the language of their parents, they often felt more comfortable responding in English or Pidgin. We call it Pidgin, it's actually a Creole that emerged among the diverse languages in Hawaii, especially laborers on the plantations. So there was a great emphasis on fostering intergenerational communications, all the while maintaining Japanese cultural identity and instilling moral values. This is why the parents would send the children to Japanese language schools after class and on Saturday mornings. Many of my friends resented this and didn't learn much Japanese, but they remember it well. So these patterns of linguistic accommodation over generations were reflected in changes in terminology, as we've noted. The change in terminology from temples to churches, Buddhist priests to ministers, and now they refer to most of the ministers as reverend. Sunday schools and Little League baseball teams were also instituted to try to maintain the young people's involvement. And this is an ongoing challenge. There's so many options for young people today. Why would they spend their Sunday morning at the temples? And I'm sorry to say, very few of them do. Another major shift was in the ordination of women. Here, we're not talking about monastic ordination as a bhikshuni or even as a novice, but there are different levels of ordination even within Jodo Shinshu. And first level is commonly received by the wives of ministers and temple staff, tokuto. And then there are different levels. And here there has been some research by Jessica Starling in an article titled Neither Nun Nor Laywomen. So there were some nuns in some of the other, celibate nuns in some of the other Japanese Buddhist schools or sects. I think sects is actually the appropriate word here. But in Honganji, they were ministers. It's a different type of ordination where they marry and have children. It's not celibate, in other words. So, and even at least one of the ministers here in Hawaii was Anglo-American, my good friend Ruth Cabra. So now we're at a crossroads. We see all the major contributions of the women of Fujinkai over the years, the diligent work that they did to establish the temples and help maintain them. Their contributions were not always recognized, unfortunately, but I think more and more they are gaining national recognition for the work that they have done. So let's see, how are we doing on time?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
Yes, keep going.
Okay, good. Okay, so, and of course, a lot of it's about leadership. For example, writing in 1989, Toku Umehara, who was the president of the Buddhist Women's Association in the Hawaii Federation, expressed the hope that women would become more proactive and prominent in Honganji overall. I expect the image of Fujinkai members to change as women are becoming educated, and they will become important members of the temples. Undoubtedly, we shall see more women as officers of their respective administrative bodies. In 1975, during her tenure, the membership of Fujinkai burgeoned to over 6,400 women. She clarified that the purpose of greater involvement in the administrative functioning of the temples would not outweigh the importance of spiritual practice, which is the core of Jodo Shinshu. However, and this is a quote, however, as our Fujinkai organizations are unique in that they are religiously oriented rather than primarily social organizations, the members should always bear uppermost in their minds that they should live the life of the Nembutsu. In order to know and understand the life of the Nembutsu, it is imperative that we listen to our Jodo Shinshu teachings at every opportunity. So again, this emphasis on the valuable roles that women have played in establishing, maintaining Buddhist temples and continue to play in modeling spiritual practice for future generations. The question today is whether the younger generation of Buddhist women in Hawaii will truly understand and continue to emulate the selfless devotion, dedication, and hard work that the pioneering generation of Fujinkai women humbly offered their temples. So, I found a quote that basically admits that the women of Honganji have been relegated to the background. And we often see that in churches and temples around the world, women in the kitchen, right? It seems to be all too common. And this writer admitted that Honganji women have been relegated to the background and that the acknowledgement of their efforts has come way too late. So now there is a time of self-reflection. The important roles that women play in the family, especially their compassionate and skillful nurturing and educating of their children, are understood to be important contributions to the growth and development of Buddhist institutions, and rightly so, in that they give rise to future generations who embody the values espoused in the Buddhist teachings. Perhaps as women become recognized for their leadership and teaching skills in Honganji and Buddhist institutions more broadly, regardless of their gender, the need for Buddhist women's associations distinct from the administrative centers of power in these institutions will become less relevant than it was at the raw beginnings of Buddhist communities in Hawaii. Women will no longer find their place only on the periphery as a vital support system for Buddhist temples and as the source of future generations of faithful Buddhists, but will take more visible leadership roles in temples and religious forums throughout the islands. Acts of cultural and political resistance in the face of overwhelming power need not be overt. The formation of Fujinkai in 1889, concurrently with the founding of the Hawaii branch of Honganji, can be seen as an assertion of subtle resistance against attempts at religious domination by the Christian majority. By steadfastly asserting their Buddhist identity, mind you, many converted to Christianity, but others, wholeheartedly asserted their Buddhist identity as well as their Japanese ethnic identity, despite the potential political and social costs. Buddhist women in Hawaii have made a powerful statement of religious integrity and independence. So wrapping up here, since the celebration of Fujinkai's centennial, remarkably documented in this commemorative volume, Buddhist women in Hawaii have witnessed many changes: smaller families and greater involvement in the workplace, sports, music, and other pursuits has left them with less time for temple activities. Whereas earlier generations of women felt strong ties to their Japanese heritage and depended on temple activities for social networking and cultural enrichment, women today have many more options to choose from. Dharma schools for children and programs for young adults have been established at most Honganji temples, but young women from Buddhist families associate Fujinkai with their mothers or grandmothers' generation. Many have not been able to find a comfortable place within the existing Japanese temples, which may appear dated or culturally exclusive unless they have close personal ties there. Gradually, young women in Hawaii drift away from the temple and only return when they have children of their own, to gather for special occasions such as Obon festivals, or contribute to social service activities such as sewing masks. In an effort to appeal to the younger generation and a broader demographic, some Honganji temples are now incorporating meditation practice and the types of classes on Buddhism that have become popular and meaningful for many people, regardless of their religious background. Yet whether these new approaches will appeal to the current generation sufficiently to spark renewed interest in the existing Buddhist women's associations remains to be seen. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Venerable, for such an insightful and interesting presentation covering almost 150 years of the development of the special group of Fujinkai women, these devout ladies of the Dharma. They held on to their spiritual roots and practices of Nembutsu for themselves and their children against all odds. I think the difficult challenges abound, and your presentation presents the evolution so well. I can see so many parallels between what's happening with the Fujinkai women and also similar Buddhist groups around the world, especially in the West. So may I now open the floor and invite participants to indicate either via the chat or raised hands if they have a question or comments. I see Christina. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your, I can't see myself, but you may be able to see me.
Yes, we can see you,
Yeah.
Christina.
I have, I enjoyed your talk, so thank you so much. Really interesting. I have, you mentioned, one thing you mentioned is the relationship with Brazil. And I must say that I have done quite a lot of research, and I have a book on Buddhism in Brazil, especially the Soto Shu, but also other groups as well, other schools of Buddhism. So what I find is not only interesting to see the comparative study, but also the connections, how the Kaikyoshu, the missionaries moved around Brazil, Hawaii, and the mainland in the US and back to Japan. So they were bringing, in my book, I talk as of how they are bringing ideas from their posts elsewhere back to Japan and then back to other places. So from Brazil to Hawaii and to mainland, especially California, San Francisco and LA, but also New York. And then, so it's interesting to see this circulation of ideas and objects and practices amongst the diasporic temples. So I think you would enjoy, there's a lot of scholarship on Buddhism in Brazil, from Tibetan to Japanese.
But
Yes.
I didn't find anything on Fujinkai in Brazil, because I was working on Buddhism in Brazil. But and you know, of course, that you know,
I do talk about the Fujinkai in the book. So it's not the main thing that I talk about. I'm interested in the circulation of ideas, but how it was, you know, settled in Brazil and hybridized with Brazilian culture, and the negotiations of power within the temple between the old Japanese migrants and the Brazilians and the second, third generation. And so you do have the women there, the Fujinkai, and how they also felt pressure to be Japanese and to speak Japanese, but also to be more modernized and equal to the men. There was a Brazilian woman who became a nun in Japan, was trained in Brazil, then trained in California, in LA, and then moved on to Japan at the Sotoshu. And when she went back, the women were pretty shocked that she was the main person in the temple. She was the head of the temple. And they were in, you know, and so she started supporting the women. So there's a whole chapter on the women there. So it may help you there in being interested. Yeah. But yeah, your research is really important, because we seldom see a full research on the women in Japanese Buddhism overseas.
Right.
There is a lot of stuff in Japan itself, in Buddhism in Japan itself, but not overseas. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Christina. Jane, you have your hand up. Yeah, unmute. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you, Venerable. That was a very interesting talk, and I appreciate the distinction you made between, I guess, the early Asian Japanese Buddhist immigrants, Buddhist women, and then also the, I guess, more of the Japanese American Buddhist experience. Because I find you're absolutely right. Being a Chinese Canadian, I guess the more kind of contemporary experience gets lost in that narrative. And so I think it's very important. My question, I think you touched upon it or started touching upon it at the end, but what were some of those factors, I guess, that are leading to the closures of the temples? And I think you touched upon it when you're talking about you know, changes to Buddhist women in the larger society, American society. But I just was wondering if you could elaborate on that, if possible.
Well, as I say, people have so many other options these days. Women are working full time. Most women are working full time. So they have professional responsibilities, they have family responsibilities, and often they have other interests as well. As we know, they basically keeping 2 full-time jobs. So the time for Buddhist activities is less than before. So that's one factor. The other is that increasingly women are taking leadership positions within the temples. So I'm looking at Kailua Honganji, which they've renamed as Windward Buddhist Temple. So they're deleting the Japanese part of the temple's name. They closed down their Fujinkai branch because the women are basically running the temple. The last few ministers have all been women, highly respected, highly successful teachers. Now, as Christina mentioned, you know, there is quite a lot of circulation of teachers, sometimes on just a Sunday morning basis. They rotate from temple to temple, which is nice because, you know, people get to hear a different talk by a different person. but sometimes they will also rotate in and out of the temple. Say they'll serve for 2 or 3 years in one temple and then be invited to serve at another temple. And so women are really taking, and some women are really taking full-time positions as ministers, highly respected, but very, very busy. But in other places, if they don't have, the ones I'm thinking of are ones who are third generation, who have done higher education, gotten advanced degrees in Buddhist studies, and become ministers. Those are the ones that are becoming successful in leadership roles. So maybe there's a, this really takes more research. And also, now one question, Christina, that you asked when reading my paper was, how does the Hawaiian experience, the Japanese Hawaiian experience, compare to the Japanese mainland experience? So the Japanese Buddhist temples in California, for example, and Oregon and Washington and all over North America, including Canada, what differences do we see in Japanese and Japanese American Buddhist women's experience? I think here in Hawaii, of course, the plantation experience was different. The fact that people were communicating across cultures. We speak Pidgin. We speak, it's a patois that is, it's a unique language, shall I say. And in those days, that was the language that developed. You don't hear that on the mainland. Here, Japanese culture is also influenced by local traditions, in many cases, meaning Hawaiian traditions. And so, but yeah, I'd like to do more with this. And I think it's a really good question. So much to learn.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat from Damika M on him being happy to note the commitment toward getting young generation involved in Buddhism.
Yes.
Yes. What's that like now in Hawaii?
It's a continuing struggle, actually, to get the younger generation involved. There's a lot of missionizing. The Christian groups are, they have coffee, donuts, food, dance party. They really woo people to join. They'll pick you up in the Korean churches have vans that go out, like fleets of vans that go out and pick people up. And so the Buddhists are a little slow on the uptake here in terms of, that's not our style. I think we don't really focus on converting people. But here in Hawaii, there are very strenuous attempts. And people say it's more convenient to become Christian because you sort of fit in. There's still, the sentiment that Buddhism is somehow foreign, different. I walked into a shop down right here in the village, and suddenly the men say, "Monk." They're third generation Japanese American. They go, "Monk." Now there's something, still considered a bit unusual, countercultural even, about Buddhism. So at the same time, of course, Buddhism is becoming very popular among a certain demographic. So, and there are Japanese Americans who have joined, say, Buddhist temples. We have Tibetan temples here. We have some that are non-sectarian, like Bodhi Meditation Center, where teachers of many different traditions come and give talks. There are still Sunday schools in some of the temples. They're still trying. Some of them on the mainland, there are a lot of little league teams, teriyaki barbecue, and different mochi pounding. At New Year's, pounding mochi. Obon is big. Obon is big, but it doesn't necessarily reach the youth. I mean, the youth may come, but mostly like to meet somebody, I think. So I'm not quite sure how to bridge that gap. It seems to me, logically, that this generation, the fourth and fifth generation, are completely American. They look Japanese, but they're American in terms of language, culture, and of course, passport. So it seems that they might be interested in meditation and philosophy like Anglo-American Buddhists. But there needs to be outreach. There need to be trained teachers. Buddhists overall lack qualified teachers. And I mean, in particular tradition, well, this is going a bit, farther afield, but I think that there's a big need for qualified teachers of Buddhism. And failing that, if they go and every time they go to the temple, they go with Four Noble Truths, after a while they get bored and don't come back, So I think we need more skillful means really to engage the younger generation.
Yeah. Christina, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just another comment in that conversation. Also, I would say that Buddhism in Japan is very much about funeral ceremonies. So people don't know their school of Buddhism until, there is a funeral in the family and then they go to the temple. So it's it's Shinto, where you go to for your third birthday, or for your coming of age at 18, and you dress nicely with your little kimono and have fun. So very much Buddhism is about the end of the year ceremonies, or born, washing the tombs for the family, for the ancestors. So it's hard to attract young people because it's not part of everyday life as much as, for example, Shinto would be. How does that play out in Hawaii?
Well, for a moment there, I thought you were going to say Japan, because the last time I was in Japan, I found, last few times I was in Japan, I found that actually the younger generations are involved in some of the temples, and I don't know how they do it. But I visited a couple of temples where there were lots of young people, and they were I think they had jobs actually in the office, and they were very dedicated. They were doing publications and so forth. I don't think they were ordained, so I don't think they were teaching or performing ceremonies, but they were very much involved in the life of the temple. Here, some are, and I guess it really depends on their, karmic affinities, may I say? Because some of them stayed Buddhist, throughout their college years. They identify as Buddhists. It probably has a lot to do with their families. I think the increasing currency that Buddhism enjoys in the United States, especially on college campuses, might help people to maintain their Buddhist cultural identities. So sometimes I try to compare with the Vietnamese community. And I noticed that the second generation Vietnamese students learned Vietnamese at the temple. And they learn chanting, and they learn basic Buddhist principles, and they stay Buddhist, and they are fluent in Vietnamese. But of course, that's first generation. And we don't know what's going to happen in the next generation. So that might be parallel with the Nisei experience, say 50 or 100 years ago. No, 50 years ago. We've got to get creative, folks. We got to get creative, I think.
Thank you. When you said that people look at you and they say monk, people look at me and they say, Kung Fu? we represent, I guess, different cultural and religious icons that it will take a little while before they appreciate what Buddhism really represents. I'm quite interested when you said that you had this meditation and philosophy emphasis. That means there's a shift, right? From a Nambutsu kind of a culture into something that's more popular. So will that be an overlap with other groups like the Soka Gakkai and other Japanese groups?
That's a huge question. I think that, well, first of all, I do notice that the Jodo Shinshu temples aren't introducing meditation. And that signals a major shift because meditation is traditionally not part of their tradition, but they see that that's what people want and what people are interested in. And so they've started, in some temples, they've started introducing it. And that means they're a cross current of influences from one tradition to the other. So when the Japanese Buddhist temples were siloed, they focused only on the teachings and founders and their own institutions. And that obviously it doesn't seem to be working. I don't know how many young people showed up for the 700th anniversary of Shinran Shonin, but I think that, a cross-fertilization of traditions could be useful. So Wailua Honganji is down here. I'm here, I'm ready, I'm happy to teach, give talks, lead meditations, but would they be open to it, you see? So now I remember about 5 years ago, they had the Jodo Shinshu Conference of California, and for the first time they invited speakers who were not Japanese American. And that was a big breakthrough. So even though they're American, they identify as American, but the speakers are generally, it's still pretty tightly focused on Jodo Shinshu ideology and practice. And so I guess it will come to a realization of whether that's working or not, but it looks like it's time to open up. And they've started inviting speakers, farther afield.
Right.
And if that's successful, I think it will signal that this is a good direction to go in if they wish to. But this is always the push and shove, isn't it, between tradition and modernization, right?
That's right.
Though people don't realize that Buddhism has been transforming itself all of the way along, right? And from the beginning, actually, there's still this idealistic sort of hope of some transcendental tradition that is inviolable. And the minute we start mixing stuff, we're going to be it's dangerous to start going further afield. So that's why different schools of Buddhism keep so rigidly closed. They're afraid of introducing outsiders and outside ideas. There's something I think that some see as threatening in that. I'm not just talking about Honganji here. I think we can, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Damika first, and then we'll have Jane next.
Thank you for taking up that comment I made. What I find is that to get the young people into the temples, as just discussed, this meditation is one of the aspects. And because this new generations, they are educated, well educated, and they have been fed with all sort of information, and they need some relaxation. Especially they need relaxation in mind. So one thing is the meditation, which you can get these young people into the temple or into the Buddhism, the next thing is the meaning of Buddha. The meaning of Buddha is the truth. So the young people wants to know always something different. So if we can teach them what is a Buddha, that it is Dhamma in the life. If it's the Buddha Dhamma is the truth of life. So that is the ultimate teaching of Buddha. So, but it is a long way. But if we can get these young people know about these things, and then they will definitely will find some time to get into the temple or get into Buddhist stream. That is my view.
Well, I think Buddhism is at an advantage here in that the Buddhist teachers, the ones that I have met, all welcome inquiry, questioning. And, you know, we don't have to accept something without question. And that fits very well with the inquiring minds of the younger generation. I think this is a strength of Buddhism, that it allows for open inquiry. The challenge here is that we have to have people who are qualified to engage them. I mean, you hear a lot of, you know, people throwing around words like emptiness, and I mean, and it's nonsense, right? But they're being hailed as teachers of Buddhism. And so I think we need to pay more attention to training a generation of qualified teachers.
Thank you. Jane?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I don't want to interrupt that really interesting conversation you guys were having about Buddhism and young people, but my question is a bit more different and focuses a bit more on racism. So I was just wondering, because you spoke about how there was a difference in the way the Japanese Americans were treated with relation to when the world wars were going on. So it's just kind of reflecting. Sorry, my dog is going on. I was just kind of reflecting on the current Asian American experience with relation to COVID and how it's kind of led to this rise in racism directed at Asian American communities. And I was just wondering anecdotally if you've seen that happen as well to Buddhist communities, either in Hawaii or on the mainland. But yeah, that was just my question.
Well, you know, race looks rather different here in Hawaii because we have a multi-ethnic population and no one is a majority. We're all minorities, right? So we have racial violence, yes, undoubtedly, but in the Buddhist community, we don't see it. Most of the I mean, anyone is welcome at a Buddhist temple. And no one would be excluded from a Buddhist temple in Hawaii. On the streets, there's so many different kinds of people. And, you know, there was a time here, if, you know, someone who was from Japanese background married someone from a Korean background, it was the end of the world. But now, I mean, if the kids marry someone who's Asian, the parents are delighted because, you know, it's a new world. It's quite different. And here I could say that some of the ministers have been Anglo-American, not Asian. There have been some ministers who were Latino or Caucasian. But on the street, racial violence, we had 2 police shootings recently of Black men. And this was really shocking to everyone. The circumstances of the shootings is very complicated. So, but it's extremely troubling. And so I can't say that we've solved racism here at all. On the mainland, it's different because you do have, well, actually in California, you no longer have a white majority. I saw this morning's paper, according to the census. But that can also be a trigger for racist attacks, feeling that they're losing, whites feeling that they're losing the majority. And so this is the world we live in is changing in terms, but I would say that racial awareness, or awareness of race and racism is increasing. People are becoming more literate, more comfortable talking about race. And even if it's an uncomfortable conversation, as we practice, we get more comfortable with it. So I think that's been a very good result of the Black Lives Matter movement. In terms of Asian racism, people, I think, were just blindsided. They didn't realize that there was that so much anti-Asian sentiment under the surface that suddenly, became expressed. That, I think, came as a shock to everyone. But why were we surprised? Because it's been simmering for decades, right? So we still have a lot to learn and work with there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other last questions? If not, I think it leaves me now to thank Venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo and to everyone for your participation and your sharing. I think this is such a delightful time for us to learn about what's happening in Hawaii, and also to this group of women, this devout women whom we've not really heard very much about. So for that, I thank you very much, Venerable, for bringing your latest research to us. Next month, on September 16th at 4 p.m. the same time, we have another exciting paper on Hawaii. This is by Helen Baroni from the University of Hawaii at Manoa on Robert Aitken and the growth of the Diamond Sangha as a Trans-Pacific Zen movement. The last webinar of this series will be held on October the 20th, The Social Sources and Cultural Forms of Buddhism in Contemporary New Zealand. This will be presented by Dr. Sally McGarkra and Professor Mark Mullins from the University of Auckland. Also, the Nantian Institute will organize an international symposium on humanistic Buddhism, where over 30 speakers will co-create a more humanistic future together with the audience. So please join us on these various events. We know that many of you live in different time zones and hence appreciate very much your sacrifices to attend this webinar. All video recordings of this webinar series are available on the Nantian Institute website and the Xingyun Education Foundation YouTube channel. The links will be posted to everyone who registered, as we are aware that some may not be able to join us in real time. By working together, we hope to bring richer and deeper insights into development and flows of Buddhism in the Pacific region. We continue to welcome expressions of interest in joining the research network. Please email our admin team at buddhism-network@nantian.edu.au with a brief note on the research area of interest and background. Till we meet again next month, updates on the webinar series can be found on the event website. May the merits of this session be dedicated to the safety of all and peace in the world. Thank you.